Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me at this moment. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. We were run a we had an explosion and we are defending immediately. Let's try our best.
People calling themselves members of the Weather Underground last night planted bombs in federal office buildings in Washington and Oakland, California.
They took the babies out of incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Survivors of the USS Liberty are demanding a congressional investigation into what happened and acknowledgement that the Israeli Air Force bombed a U.S. intelligence Navy ship.
The death of bin Laden marks the most significant achievement to date in our nation's effort to defeat al-Qaeda.
The Taliban is taking responsibility for shooting down a U.S. helicopter. More than 30 people were killed, and there are reports this morning that most of them are U.S. Navy SEALs.
There may be a false flag incident where some ship goes down and you be used for the excuse to accelerate the next war.
If there's one thing that has unified Democrats and Republicans, and everybody in between, it's that we all hated the bank bailout.
The Department of Homeland Security is apparently on a huge ammo buying spree.
It comes out to like 1.6 billion rounds of ammunition.
Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people.
They estimated that they would have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. And when I say eliminate, I mean kill.
I'm here to warn people. You keep telling me to shut up. This isn't a game.
From the front lines of the information war, it's Alex Jones.
Harvard professor warns of devastating China-Japan war. Russian study says U.S. could easily defeat Beijing in nuclear conflict, as the president of China and others in the last month have said prepare for all-out multi-theater conventional war and nuclear war with the United States. And, of course, they said last week in the People's Daily and other state-run media that they are going to invade Philippine Islands that they claim really belong to China, that Japan took, and that they're also going to take other disputed islands by Japan. And if that happens, there will be war. Now, I understand Justin Bieber's in the news. He got a DWI. And that's very important as well. But we're not going to be talking about that. I already talked about entertainment industry and the mass mental illness of it and people being distracted, fiddling while Rome burns. But we are joined for the next 25 minutes by Professor Margaret MacMillan from Oxford. I'm going to be out at Oxford in the middle of March doing a keynote speech. I look forward to doing that. I always wanted to go to Oxford. Honored to do that. And she has margaretmacmillan.com. She's a prestigious professor. And is the 5th warden of St. Anthony's College. In 2007, she was educated at University of Toronto College and Oxford University. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. And I'm not going to go over on the boards of Mosaic Institute, Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and the editorial boards of international history and First World War Study. She's an expert on the World War, First World War. Professors' publications include Women of the Raja and well as Peacemakers, the Paris Conference in 1919, and its attempt to make peace, for which she won many awards. I'm not going to go over the rest of her letters and all the work she's done. Her most recent book is The War That Ended Peace, How Europe's Abandoned Peace from the First World War. I guess that goes into Versailles. I haven't read it. She comments frequently in the media, and she joins us now, margaretmacmillan.com. Thank you so much for coming on, Professor. And I want to get into the report I saw at the London Independent. Is it 1914 all over again? We are in danger of repeating the mistakes that started World War I, says a leading historian. So thanks for coming on, and tell us about the parallels and your concern.
Well, there's some things that concern me. I mean, I don't think history ever repeats itself. I think we get similarities, but the conditions are so different. I mean, the 21st century is very different from 100 years ago. But I think what is concerning is we seem to have nationalist rivalries between countries. You have a rivalry developing, as you were mentioning earlier on, in the South China Seas, which has the potential for sparking off further tensions and conflicts. You have international ideologies. In the years before 1914, they were international ideologies of anarchists, for example. Today you have international ideologies, of religious ideologies or ultra-religious ideologies. So I think we live in a slightly turbulent time. We have globalization. Both ages are very globalized, and I think you have people worried about the impact of globalization, perhaps turning to their homes and feeling rather defensive. So I think that there are similarities. I mean, I don't think we're bound to end up in the same way they did in 1914, but you always have to be careful.
I forget the exact quote, but basically history doesn't repeat, but it kind of rhymes. Who was it said that?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain. And humans act the same, even though we have almost godlike weapons and technology now, would be godlike, to the ancients, Professor. But if you look at global crises, currency devaluations, armies lining up on borders, groups not compromising. Really, I see the West driving conflict, and I'm obviously not a fan of what Russia and China do. I'm an American, and I'm a Westerner. But at the same time, I really see the West as filling the shoes of the villain in many respects compared to our position in the past. Well, what's your take on that?
Well, I think human nature doesn't really change that much. I mean, I think we like to think we're a lot more sophisticated than the caveman. I'm not sure we are. I mean, I think we're still driven, at least in part, by emotions and fears. And I think what's really dangerous is when people lack, or nations lack, the ability to see things from the other person's point of view. And so what nations do to defend themselves and what we do to defend ourselves as individuals, we may think we're just being defensive, we're just looking out for ourselves, but that may really look like aggression from the other side. And I think that's when it gets dangerous, when you fail to understand what the other person might be thinking. And I think what's also dangerous, and you see it with individuals and you see it with nations again, is when their pride gets involved and when their prestige gets involved. I mean, I think an analogy is the members of gangs, who are, to me, rather like knights in the Middle Ages. They'd rather die than be dishonored. And so I think this is a perennial strain in human nature. Now, we've got a more sensible side, and I think we've got a more reasonable side, and we've got a side where we do reach out, we do try and understand each other. So, I never like to think that history is going to repeat itself, but I think we should be warned, we should be careful about being too complacent.
History doesn't repeat, it does rhyme, and I think that is true as Mark Twain said it. I mean, here's the issue. You look at the moral authority of the United States or England or many European countries. Look at France in the just disheveled nature that it's going into from what I've been seeing and traveling and witnessing. And there is, I see a cyclical, and of course there's cycles within cycles, and I'd like you to speak to that, Professor, because you're an expert on that. I do see us going into a very sick bottom of the cycle. All the same indicators, the decadence, the debt, the corruption, the almost laissez-faire attitude of dictatorial government and corporations, the power grabbing. And as the establishment senses that, it makes basically everyone become even more feverish, including myself, adding to almost the same electrical hysteria that you see in mass movements of almost like, rats overpopulated in the sewers killing each other. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing a gestalt out there. What's your take on what I'm saying?
Well, it's a pretty gloomy picture you have, and I hope it's not all true. But, I think there are things we need to look out for in our own societies. I mean, I don't worry about government debt so much because government debt, if it's going into building infrastructure, I think is actually positively a good thing, just like we borrow to buy houses through mortgages. But what I do think is worrying, and I think it's affecting a lot of Western societies, is the growing gap between the very rich and the very poor and the way the middle class is getting squeezed out. And that isn't good for society. It leads to tensions. It leads to a lack of links between the different groups in societies. And I think you don't want a society in which a very few people at the top control a great deal of the resources of that society and are able to live in a way which insulates them from the problems of society, because it means they're probably going to have less understanding and less empathy for those who are less fortunate than themselves.
Separately, what other historical trends are you seeing? And then flesh out, if you can, some of the parallels that they were reporting on that you've seen. I guess would it be geopolitically parallels with 1914 and 2014?
Well, one that a lot of people have talked about, including me, and I don't know if we're right. The thing about talking about the present is you're usually much too close to it to get a very good view of it. But it seems to me you do have tensions in the world internationally now, because you have what had been a dominant power no longer as dominant as it was. It doesn't mean it's that much weaker, but it's no longer quite as dominant as it was. Before 1914, that was the British Empire, which was the world's biggest empire the world has ever seen. Hugely powerful, had the world's biggest navy, had been the world's biggest manufacturing power, but that was now being challenged. And you had a Britain and its empire that was very conscious that it was beginning to slip a bit, that it had competitors like the United States and Germany and Japan. And it seems to me today that you have the United States, which, for much of the Cold War and certainly after the Cold War was overwhelmingly the most important and powerful country in the world. It's no longer perhaps quite as powerful as it was, and that can lead to tension, because nations that feel themselves to be slipping a little bit may react in ways that aren't always predictable, and nations that sort of feel that they haven't yet got their share in the sun can be aggressive and not very tactful. I mean, Germany was not tactful before the First World War. It was sort of pushing its way into the world order and throwing its weight around. And I would say that China's not being particularly tactful today. And so it doesn't make for an easy international situation managing these shifts, often very subtle shifts in the international order.
Exactly. I mean, China's not being tactful when they basically say, prepare the nuclear weapons for war with the United States. That is a brazen escalation and quite frankly, frightening.
Well, it seems to me very foolish of the Chinese because, some of the rhetoric is coming. I mean, I don't think Chinese foreign policy is necessarily guided by a single sort of central agency, because you'll get the party saying one thing, you'll get the military saying another thing. You now have a Chinese public opinion, which is beginning to play a role. But it does seem to me that the Chinese are very silly, in my view, to talk in a particularly belligerent way, because they haven't yet got the capacity to back up those belligerent statements. And what they will do, as so often happens, is they may well create a coalition against them. I mean, they're not doing a lot to get on with their neighbors at the moment. And, they need those neighbors. I mean, they may disapprove of a lot of what the Japanese do, but in the end, the Chinese, I think, are better off living in a world in which they get on with their neighbors rather than having all those neighbors furious at them.
Well, sure, and as you know, there's the enmity because of the Japanese invasion of China and a million dead or whatever the number is. And so I know I've seen the numbers that the Chinese, on average, I think would like a war with Japan when it's not even the same people that did this to them 70 years ago. And so I see that as obviously where the big war could kick off.
Well, I think it's a danger, but I think the Chinese leadership, and let's hope they have the sense to see this, would not gain by a war with Japan. I mean, both countries would suffer horribly, because one thing, as you mentioned earlier, that has changed since 100 years ago is that the weapons are an awful lot more powerful, and the capacity to do real damage is that much greater. So, you would end up with a war, if you had one, in which really neither side would win. And in fact, that's what happened in the First World War. I mean, if you look at the end of the First World War, even the winning side had spent down their resources, lost men.
Renowned author and expert Joel Skousen breaks down the globalist plan to shut down America and stage a new world war.
In one day, America will go from day to night. And if you haven't prepared in advance, there's not enough time to prepare in 24 hours, even if you saw it that early.
Coming to the InfoWar in November is our new documentary film presentation.
Strategic relocation is a systematic way to think strategically in the future about how do I safeguard.
Joel Skousen, Strategic Relocation.
The freeways are going to be crowded, they're going to run out of gasoline, they're going to run out of food, and then they're going to start to go north and south of those freeways.
Joel Skousen is renowned as one of the world's foremost experts in strategic relocation and the securing of your home.
We talk about natural disasters, the health environment, we talk about pollution, the water quality. My personal experience about being in every one of these states.
Government is digging in for the organized, incremental collapse of society and world war.
The U.S. isn't building huge underground bases and bunkers because of some terrorist threat. They know that a massive nuclear attack is coming. They want that attack to come. Most people won't even be ready and won't be able to get out of town when any of these nuclear weapons fall, because there'll be absolute panic.
There is no preparedness without strategy.
What I tell people is that you do have time. Prepare wisely in advance.
This Christmas, give the gift of preparedness. Strategic Relocation, the film, with Joel Skousen and Alex Jones.
The problem is all these other countries have the same types of elites in them from my research. And so it just keeps, historically, and I don't have a degree in history, but I do love reading history books. And it just, to me, as a lay person that likes history, man, I see so many parallels just everywhere. And most analysts, Pentagon, colonels, generals we have on, retired, current, the think tanks, the British think tanks, the British Ministry of Defense, the Pentagon, they're all saying the same things that I'm basically saying. I'm not trying to put a bleak view on it. I want us to look at how it could be bleak if we don't do something. Let me ask you that, Professor, in the 6 minutes we've got left, other topics that you'd like to put forward. You know, what's front and center in your mind, because you are a very intelligent person who's tracked a lot of trends. But I mean, what's your comment on what I just said, and then what's the essence of what you think people should know out there, that if we don't know history, then we tend to repeat the same human mistakes? Well,
I mean, you do paint a pretty bleak picture, and I'm not sure I disagree with you completely. I think history is not going to teach us very clear lessons about the future. It's not going to say, do this and all will be okay. But what history can do is give you a greater understanding of what can go wrong. I think it can give you a greater understanding of other people. I mean, if you don't understand the history of other people, you're not going to understand a lot about them. And it also gives you a greater understanding of yourself. I mean, I think we tend to deceive ourselves and think, we've always been nice guys or whatever. And I think we need to look at our histories in the round. So what I think history can do, and other things do it as well, like sociology and psychology, they help you to understand human beings better, help us to understand ourselves better. And I think history can offer at least warnings. It's like seeing a sign on a road that, be careful, this bridge is slippery, in winter. And what history can do is say, look, if you invade someone else's country, you're likely to run into trouble if they don't want you there. I mean, this may seem a very simple lesson. Or what history can say is, if you don't try and understand the perspective of the other person, you're probably going to behave in ways that frighten them, alienate them, make them want to do stupid things. So I think history can help us to understand how to act in a complicated world. But I think we have got to rely on ourselves to think intelligently about the world. We can't rely on anyone providing us with lessons. We've got to keep alert. We've got to keep thinking. We can't just relax and say, well, our leaders know best. I mean, I think we've all got to take a responsibility as citizens to trying to understand the world we live in.
Looking at the different areas of the world that are in increased conflict and tension, what are the big hot spots for you, Professor?
Well, the hot spots, I mean, I think East Asia is a potential hot spot. I think the Middle East remains a hot spot because areas of the world where you have local divisions and rivalries are troublesome for the people who live there in themselves, but they also, if they are geographically in the wrong places, run the risk of drawing outside powers in. And so what makes East Asia, the South China Sea, potentially perilous, and what makes the Middle East potentially perilous is not just the local conflicts there, but the potential they have to draw in other great powers.
Well, I see Russia trying to reorganize itself as a great opportunity if the West would actually try to collaborate with them. But instead, they see Russia as weak, obviously, so they're sending in the destabilization forces into Kiev, in the Ukraine. Yeah. And obviously, I don't want the Ukraine to join back with Russia again, but they don't want to be part of the collapsing EU. Yeah. And so then the CIA's there trying to destabilize it. I mean, they're on record doing that. And of course, the Russians are getting angry. It just seems like a real lost opportunity by the.
Sorry, I think generally in the West we've mishandled Russia since the end of the Cold War. I mean, Russia is an old country, very strong sense of itself. Russians are proud people, and when they lost the Cold War, which they clearly did, we treated them with contempt. We treated them like people who didn't know what they were doing. And I think you have a great sense of resentment in Russia, and I think you see that in Putin's behavior today. He's trying to reassert Russia on the world stage and show that Russia can't be pushed around. And I think we lost an opportunity there. And I think we're now going to have to deal with a much more aggressive Russia. I don't think aggressive militarily, but it's going to be asserting itself a lot more on the world stage. It's already asserting itself in the Middle East. in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, in Belarus. And I think we're going to see a Russia that's more prepared to sort of really play a part in the world.
It's unbelievable, and it's because the weapons manufacturers want to continue selling weapons until they basically kill us all, and it's just a real crisis. Well, I hope sometime you'll come back on with us and talk about Russia, and people can find out more about your great books and more at MargaretMacMillan.com. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure talking to you. Really neat lady. I'm going to read some of her books.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the site, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.